The Lost Year, Chapter 13, A Revelation. Arthur was awake well before dawn. He took the last watch from Willis, mostly because he couldn't sleep. He kept imagining what they would find when they reached the fortress. There were only 6 of them. In all reality, it was a suicide mission to go after Merlin and Leon, but he would not turn back. He couldn't. Leon was his oldest companion, more of a brother than any of his other brothers in arms. And Merlin? He could not remember how he'd survived life without her. Thinking back, he could not stand the man he'd been just 2 years ago, though it was getting closer to 2.5 now. Arthur shook his head, thinking about that first fateful meeting. Back then, he'd seen a scrawny little girl, maybe a year younger than him, standing up where others wouldn't. She defended his old manservant, Morris, who'd quit shortly after that interaction, when Arthur had been throwing knives at him. He knew he shouldn't have. Looking back, he realized he could have killed the poor boy, and it really hadn't been fair to toss Merlin in a cell for standing up to him. Yes, she'd tried to slap him, but he'd deserved it, making some questionable comments about her ability to walk on her knees. Their second meeting hadn't gone much better. He'd spotted her in the market the next day. Perhaps it had been unreasonable after everything to expect her to fawn over him like every other maiden in the kingdom did when he gave them any kind of attention. But he'd never known anything different. The comments had gotten worse, coming from him and the young knights he once surrounded himself with, as they practically chased her through the market. In hindsight, he could see how threatening that had been. He didn't really blame her for laughing when he tripped over a stray rope and landed face first in a pile of muck. The other peasants in the lower town hid their laughter behind hands and nervous glances, but Merlin had tilted her head back and laughed. She'd given the most sarcastic curtsy Arthur had ever seen in his life, along with an equally sarcastic, "My lord," and vanished into the crowd. He hadn't seen her again until the mess with the witch wearing Lady Helen's face. The snapping of a twig caught his attention, and he pulled his sword, nudging Willis in the side to wake him. He motioned for the squire to wake the others. Willis scrambled to obey as Arthur turned to the source of the noise. It was coming from the direction of the castle. An ambush? They'd lit no fire. There should have been no way to track them. Arthur nodded to the others to slip into hiding spots. He stepped behind a tree, his sword at the ready. Silence echoed, save for the soft sound of a set of footsteps. No, 2. One markedly lighter than the other. They were approaching the camp as the first fingers of dawn broke over the horizon. With the sun at his back, Arthur lunged around the tree. His blade met with an unfamiliar one, but the hand wielding it was as familiar as his own. "Leon," he said in relief as Merlin peeked around the night. Arthur let out a long breath as the other knights cheered, coming out of their hiding places. Both Arthur and Leon stowed their swords, Arthur patting him on the shoulder. In the light of dawn, he could see that Leon was bruised, and Merlin had a spectacular one across her forehead, but otherwise they seemed unharmed. "How did you make it out?" Franken asked, clapping Leon on the shoulder as Merlin smiled, spotting her horse across the clearing. They'd been lucky and found the horses nearby when they went to collect the bodies of the 2 knights they'd lost. Roderick and Gavin had been buried under piles of stone they'd managed to gather as the night wore on. None of them had slept much. Merlin patted her horse, which nosed at her, whickering in worry as it gently bumped its head against hers. "Merlin got us out," Leon said, making the others turn to her. "Brained a guard with a stone pitcher after picking, 3 locks? All with a hairpin?" He said as Merlin laid her head on the neck of her horse, her blush only evident because the back of her neck now matched her tunic of Camelot crimson. "Not to mention she choked a man into unconsciousness with her bare hands." "Technically, I used my arm," Merlin said as several of the knights whistled. Willis glanced between Merlin and Leon. "Seriously?" he asked. Arthur stepped over to Merlin, tilting her head back to look at the bruise on her forehead. "Never underestimate a physician," Merlin said, gently pulling back from Arthur and retrieving a large bag from her saddle. It proved to be a well-stocked physician's kit. one she opened now and began to rummage through. If a person knows how to put you back together, chances are they know 1,000 ways to take you apart as well, Merlin pointed out as she found what she was looking for. Speaking of putting people back together, let's see if we can ease those bruises, Sir Leon. Anyone else injured? She asked, and the knights gathered around her in a loose circle. When she was finished treating Leon, Arthur took the poultice from her and dabbed the remaining on her bruise. We'll set out as soon as everyone's treated, circle back and meet up with the next patrol, then see about clearing out this scum. Arthur instructed, and everyone nodded. Leon was grateful to Merlin, both for getting them out of the bandits' keep and for her skill with medicine. He decided that the best way to show it was to follow through in teaching her as he'd planned. So, once they joined up with the larger patrol and the bandits were dealt with for good, Leon pulled her aside at the campfire. Pick a weapon, any weapon. I will teach you to use it. You need to know how to properly defend yourself, he said, and she blinked at him. Isn't that against the rules? Merlin asked, her voice lowered. Arthur's not going to stop it. He wants you safe. We'll be out looking for Morgana for a while unless we stumble on her sooner. The likelihood of that dwindled by the day. Uther need never know, Leon said, and Merlin's grin turned sly. I think I may have been a bad influence on you, Sir Leon, she said, trying not to laugh. Leon shook his head. I'm not sure that's true. And so it began. Every night, for at least an hour after camp was made, Leon pulled Merlin aside and they tested her ability with different weapons. He wrote a few of them off quickly. Maces and clubs were too unwieldy for her. A sword was a decent weapon, and her aim with throwing knives was particularly good, but they didn't find her best fit until Leon tossed her a quarterstaff. She laid him out with it, bruising the backs of his calves rather severely. She improved quickly with the staff, and Arthur, who'd taken to watching them fight and shouting pointers, along with a few of his other loyal knights, grew impressed. Never would have guessed that the thing you'd be good at was staff combat, he joked, and Merlin rolled her eyes, tying her hair back before she mounted her horse again. This went on for nearly 3 months. In that time, Leon kept a close eye on Merlin. Part of it was out of protectiveness. She had grown to be the younger sister he'd never had. But part of it was what she had said in the dungeon. People see what they expect to see. The truth of that had hit home with Leon. He was the first knight of Camelot, the most skilled of them, their leader. And he had no idea he'd had an asset beyond a healer in Merlin. He'd overlooked her because he expected nothing more than what she was supposed to be. If he did that with an enemy, it could mean his end, as it had for at least one of the bandits Merlin had attacked. But in watching closer, he spotted something odd. Merlin had always been a bit of a mystery. No one really seemed to know much about her, but Leon had noticed a few things. She could always get the campfire lit when others failed, no matter how damp the wood seemed to be. If they were attacked, she would join in when she could, but when she was around, their luck seemed to be exponentially better than if she was separated from the group. It wasn't until about a month and a half in that he spotted the most odd thing. When Merlin was alone, lighting the cook fire in the middle of the camp, or trying to, Leon was across from her, working on one of the maps. While there was still enough light to do so. He glanced up just in time to see Merlin look around. She didn't see him looking, though. She couldn't have. If she did, she wouldn't have held out her hand and whispered something he couldn't hear. Her eyes wouldn't have glowed gold as fire caught in the wood in front of her, hiding her from sight. Suddenly, a lot of things made sense. And even more of them didn't. He snapped his eyes back to the map in front of him, not really seeing it. Merlin had magic. Merlin used magic to light the fire that was now merrily crackling in front of them. He heard Arthur laugh and risked a glance up. Merlin was talking about something, gesticulating wildly as Arthur watched her, a fond expression clear on his face. Prince Arthur Pendragon was in love with a sorceress. Wasn't that just perfect? The universe had to be laughing at all of them right now, Leon especially. His job was to turn her in. He knew that. But could he? Morally, no. He couldn't. She'd saved Arthur's life so many times, openly and in front of too many witnesses for it to be some kind of ploy, but also with the small things she did. Arthur was a better man with her around. It had not been some quick transformation that Leon could put down to a spell either, but a genuine growth of character. Merlin made him better by her presence alone. Perhaps it was just some minor spell crafting, things that could be easily overlooked. She had to know she was doing it. That was how magic worked, after all. And she had spoken a spell to start the fire. But as he lay awake that night, battling with his own indecision, a few things came back to him. Lancelot had killed a creature that Gaius had said could only be slain by magic, and then left before he could even be offered his knighthood back. Had he slain the griffin at all, or had he simply refused to out the one who had? He sat up as something else occurred. Gwen's father had been cured of the plague, the one caused by a beast in the water. Gwen had been accused of witchcraft for curing her father. Merlin had come bursting into the hall. "Gwen is not the sorcerer. I am." He repeated her words to himself quietly. He was lucky not to share a tent. She had admitted to it. Of her own free will. She had not been spelled to take the blame as some had suspected. She had healed Tom. He would bet his blade that Gaius had lied and the poultice had been magical. He stood, shaking himself slightly, as he exited the tent and made his way to the campfire. It wasn't abandoned, as he'd hoped. Instead, the object of his crisis sat beside the fire, feeding twigs into the dwindling flames. They reflected in sapphire blue eyes, turning them nearly golden as the flash he'd seen. She looked up as he stepped up to the fire. "Sir Leon, is it your watch already?" she asked, keeping her voice quiet. "No, I couldn't sleep." "Why are you awake?" "Sir Franken's leg is infected. I need to drive out the infection. Only one way to do that out here," she said, gesturing to the pot on the fire. It was full of bubbling wine. "Will he be all right?" Leon asked. "Should be. Arthur says he'll send a few of the more injured men back to Camelot since we're no more than 2 days' ride back," she said. "Will you go with them?" Leon asked. "No. Galahad is. He's got enough basic medical knowledge to keep them alive until they can get to Gaius," Merlin said, and Leon frowned. "I would think you'd want to see your patients safely home." "I do, but we both know Arthur would be doomed without me," she said with a conspiratorial grin. Leon laughed as Merlin wrapped a cloth around her hand and retrieved the pot of boiling wine, heading back into the healer's tent with it. Only then did Leon recall a conversation he'd had with Arthur shortly after he'd been released from the dungeon cell his father had tossed him into after he'd gone after the Mortius flower. "There was a light. Some kind of sorcery, I'm sure, but it saved me, Leon. I don't know what to make of it," Arthur had said, glancing at the healer's tent. Leon was beginning to realize that Merlin hadn't been joking. Arthur would be dead without her. And it was Leon's first priority to keep her alive. To keep Arthur alive. If the best way to do that was to aid and abet treason, well, what no one knew couldn't hurt either of them.